Thank you, Dwight, and good afternoon, opera lovers, and maybe those who are a little less enthusiastic about opera if you're listening this afternoon. I'm glad to be back with you on WHRO, and we're going to take a look at an opera that a lot of people think they know very well, Gershwin's Porgy and Bess. I've done several classes and seminars about this popular piece all over the region for the past several weeks, and I have learned something. People feel very proprietary about this show. People always want to tell me about their experiences with Porgy. Oh, I saw it with Leontine Price in Vienna in 1949. Oh, I saw it with Todd Duncan in Paris and so forth. And people feel ownership of this wonderful score because so many of the titles of the musical numbers are familiar enough that they kind of transcend the operatic vista and have become iconic in our culture, practically folk songs, almost folk material. You know the titles: Summertime, I Got Plenty of Nuttin', It Ain't Necessarily So. There's several of those. However, there's also the Porgy and Bess that nobody knows because we don't often hear the full operatic version. For decades, this show existed in a kind of a Reader's Digest version that excluded some of the heavier musical numbers and concentrated on the folk-like and Broadway-esque musical portions of the score, leading to misunderstandings about what the nature of this work is. Is it a Broadway musical? Is it an opera? Is it an operetta? Is it an 18th century oratorio? Well, I think we can rule that one out. No, it's not that. We'll have some thoughts about that. One thing I would like to say at the outset is that the most amazing thing about Porgy and Bess is that it's as accomplished as it is, considering that for all practical purposes, it's Gershwin's first opera. Think about some of the first operas of some of the other great opera composers. Puccini, his first opera is Edgar. Is that one of your favorites? No, probably not. Verdi's was King for a Day. Wagner's was a piece called The Fairies. It takes, opera is hard, and even the great masters of the form usually have to have a few attempts to hit their stride, find that magic combination of libretto and music that produces a masterwork. The amazing thing is that Gershwin's Porgy and Bess is as good as it is. If any other composer had tried to accomplish what Gershwin attempted in Porgy and Bess, it might have been a debacle, a catastrophe, a horrible flop, because there's something unusual going on. I'd like to compare Porgy and Bess reminds me, my friends, of an episode of the old NBC TV sitcom Friends. Any of you remember that show? You know the characters Ross and Rachel and Monica and Chandler and Phoebe and Joey. Well, there was one episode in which Rachel, who was the spoiled rich girl, wanted to impress the rest of her friends with her cooking abilities. She was going to learn to cook to show how practical she could be. And she decided to make an English trifle. Well, you know what that is. That's a dessert with custard and jam and cake and cream. But Rachel, who was a bit of a ditz brain, tore out 2 pages of the cooking magazine thinking there was all one recipe. And to the dessert, she added ground beef and onions and tomatoes, resulting in something a little intimidating that nobody was really interested in eating. My friends, Gershwin's score to Porgy and Bess is a little bit like Rachel's trifle. There's no such music as this because since America is a melting pot of different cultures, Gershwin recognized that maybe American opera should be a melting pot of musical styles. So he drew from 3 basic sources of music in constructing the score to Porgy. That would be folk music, popular music, and classical music. Folk music, you have sea shanties, hymns, spirituals, all sorts of music of the people. Then in the popular era, you have Tin Pan Alley style, the burgeoning songwriting industry that was sweeping the United States at that time, along with Broadway and blues and jazz. And then you have all the features you expect to find in an opera: leitmotifs, counterpoint, a classical orchestra, full-fledged soaring operatic voices, arias, recitatives, you name it. Those things don't all go together. They really don't. And how does Gershwin get away with it? Well, we'll take a look at that, but I can give you the answer in one word. It's called genius. When you're a genius, you can get away with a lot. You can get away with murder. It covers up a host of awkwardness and technical problems. But, a lot of people feel that this is not an opera. They'll come up to me after one of my classes and say, well, Glenn, you make some nice points, but Porgy and Bess is not an opera. And I understand why they feel that way, especially when you have musical moments like this one from the character Sportin' Life.
It ain't necessarily so.
It ain't necessarily so.
The things that you're liable to read in the Bible, it ain't necessarily so.
Yeah, that's not opera music, is it? We all know what opera music sounds like. It's big, fat, 320-pound women with horns on their heads emitting ear-splitting shrieks in a foreign language. That wasn't opera. That was Broadway, wasn't it? Well, you see, that's one of those disparate elements musically of Porgy and Bess that surprises us if we know the complete opera. And I'll tell you, the reason that Gershwin uses that style, that unadulterated Broadway style, unashamedly New York, is for a dramatic reason. In a Broadway show, you would use that style just to have a nice toe-tapping tune for entertainment. There's another purpose at work in Porgy and Bess when Sportin' Life sings that ironic take on biblical stories. No one else in the show really sings in a Broadway style, just Sportin' Life. And why is that? Because in the fictional community of Catfish Row here in coastal South Carolina in the 1930s, he is an outsider. He is not a South Carolinian. He is from the big city of New York and brings his gambling and con artist scams and cocaine and other kinds of dope and alcohol with him to kind of contaminate this community. So it's important that he sound like New York. You see, his music has a dramatic purpose to establish where he's from. And speaking of that, I want to tell you a little bit about the first great tune that comes along at the top of Act 1. The lullaby, Summertime. You know it. You could probably sing it. Summertime, and you're singing along with me, I'm sure. Now, again, this music has a specific dramatic purpose, which makes it more operatic than simply a lovely, somewhat bluesy tune with good opportunities to display a pretty soprano voice. What's happening here is that Gershwin puts it near the top of the show to give us a sense of locale, to establish the geographical setting. Where are we? We're in coastal South Carolina. Now, my friends, I've been married for 34 years now to my lovely wife, Ruth, who is from a tiny little town in South Carolina. And I have spent more hours and days and weeks and months in little South Carolina communities than any Yankee boy from Chicago ever thought he would. And I have learned something about life in South Carolina. Things move at a slower pace. You best not be in a hurry when it's the dead of summer in South Carolina, because it's too hot to move. And as we listen to the introduction and the beginning of this aria, Summertime, notice how in the orchestra, after a lively beginning in the overture or the prelude, we hear eighth notes in the clarinet, dee-da, 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 and those immediately slow down to half the tempo in quarter notes, dee-da, dee-da, and then they slow down by half again as much to half notes. Dee-da. You can feel your blood pressure lowering as the orchestra sets the tone, and the minute that Clara starts singing to her baby, you know exactly where you are. You're in the low country of South Carolina. Again, my point is that in opera, everything has a dramatic purpose to reveal location, to set the scene, to reveal states of mind. Uh, it's never just about being ear candy, although, let's face it, that's some pretty glorious ear candy, isn't it? Um, Clara is one of the respectable members of the Catfish Row community, this small little fishing village. Uh, there's a lot of tough stuff in the story of Porgy and Bess, a lot of the seamy sides of the life of poor people. It's what you might call American verismo. Gershwin is very much influenced by the verismo movement of showing the foibles and weaknesses of ordinary people that we see in Pagliacci and Cavalleria Rusticana and many of the other verismo classics from Italy. This is American verismo, and you're going to see drug use, violence, knife fights, murders, women of easy virtue in Bess, con men, alcoholism, a lot of tough stuff. However, counterbalancing that, we have the good folks, the good-hearted, hard-working people. Clara is one of those. Her husband, Jake, who's got a great work ethic and goes out to fish in his little boat every day to provide for his family and provide a better life for his baby. They're examples of that. And Jake is now going to take his turn at singing a lullaby to his infant son before he goes out to do a day's work of fishing. And now we're going to hear an example of vocal jazz. This, of course, is not real jazz. It's jazz styles. As you listen to him give a little life lesson about the nature of women, women are a sometime thing to his young son, you'll notice that you'll hear jazz harmonies, blue notes in the melody versus the orchestra, jazz rhythms, and also listen to how the nature of the orchestral writing changes. You'll hear that little tinny jazz trumpet that turns a classical orchestra into something like a pit band for a Broadway musical as he sings "A Woman is a Sometime Thing."
Listen to your daddy warn you before you start traveling. Woman may born ya, love you and mourn ya, but a woman is a sometime thing. Yes, a woman is a sometime thing. Your mammy is the first to name you, then she'll tie you to her apron string. Then she'll shame you and she'll blame you till your woman comes to claim you. 'Cause a woman is a sometime thing. Yes, a woman is a sometime thing.
Now, Gershwin was very concerned that he get it right in presenting an authentic version of African American life in the deep South, in the coastal South Carolina, which might seem like a challenge. After all, he's the son of Russian Jewish immigrants and grew up in Brooklyn. What would he know about this culture? Well, he recognized that he knew a great deal about the jazz music of the African-American folks from his studies of the great jazz musicians in Harlem and elsewhere. But he wanted to really nail it. So he did spend several months in 1934, the year prior to Porgy's world premiere in 1935, living in coastal South Carolina, dwelling in these villages, communing with the people, going to church choir rehearsals, sitting in barber shops and coffee shops, listening to the cadence of speech and the way that the music was sung. And he soaked it up like a sponge and did a great job at assimilating that into the score. Now, there is, at the top of scene 2, after our villain, Crown, has killed a nice fellow named Robbins in a dispute over a card game, or a craps game, actually, there's going to be a wake. The citizens of Catfish Row have gathered to pay respects to the body of Robbins and bring some comfort to Serena, his widow. And now there's going to be a little bit of what I would call the folk element. We're familiar that one of the heritages of African-American music is the call and response. We hear this in work songs, in some types of hymns and spirituals, and you're going to hear it at this wake. The call and response is a very powerful kind of folk music. You'll hear a soloist sing, "Where is Brother Robbins?" And the other citizens answer, "He's gone, 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 gone." Now, this is highly stylized, to be sure, with some very sophisticated harmonies, but it is a stylized version of music that Gershwin actually heard in observing life in South Carolina. Very powerful, very evocative, and I dare say that may fall into the category for many of you of the unknown Porgy and Bess. Gosh, I never heard that one before. Well, trust me, those of you who think you know Porgy and Bess, unless you're a real opera nerd, as I like to refer to my fellow opera lovers, you may find that you actually only know about 15 to 20% of this wonderfully rich score. Now, one of the more familiar numbers, and for my money, one of the highlights of Porgy and Bess, one of the truly successful moments. If you were listening at the top of this broadcast, I made a food analogy comparing Porgy and Bess to Rachel's attempt to make a trifle in the TV show Friends, mixing whipped cream and jam and cake with ground beef and onions. Well, there are perhaps moments that are a little bit like that in Porgy, where the contrast of styles is a bit jarring, but then again, sometimes he achieves something remarkable. And in this scene of the wake for Mr. Robbins, his widow Serena will pour out her grief in a magnificent and moving aria, a very compelling solo called My Man's Gone Now. Now here it's not so much Rachel's trifle I'll use another food analogy. It's like pesto. You know, you know what's in pesto: pine nuts, basil, olive oil. Well, if I give you a handful of toasted pine nuts, that's not spaghetti sauce, is it? That's a bunch of seeds. How about a handful of fresh green basil leaves? Are basil leaves a spaghetti sauce? No, they're just leaves. Same with olive oil. That's a fat. It's not a spaghetti sauce. But if I take those three elements and put them in a blender for about 30 seconds, what comes out is not any of those three, but a new product that's a synthesis of all three, pesto sauce. Now you've got spaghetti sauce. This is what happens in My Man's Gone Now. Friends, if the entire opera had achieved what this aria achieves, Porgy and Bess would be one of the supreme masterpieces in all of opera. Because you have the operatic element, the classical element. Oh, a soaring vocal line that is just as hair-raising as anything Puccini or Wagner ever came up with. The magnificence of the full, soaring lyric soprano voice and a classical orchestra. You have the jazz harmonies and syncopated jazz rhythm that lend a particularly poignant, dissonant note of despair. And then, what is the folk element? Well, again, I know something about how life is lived in South Carolina. My wife's grandmother, Louise Easterling, was an organist who played for all the funerals in Dillon County, South Carolina back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Black and white, you name it, any funeral. And she learned that African-American funerals have a way of sharing grief communally. You support one another. You don't rein in your emotions. That's a way to get a heart attack or an ulcer. You let it out. You weep loudly. You may swoon. You may faint. People support you, and they join in with this kind of public grieving. It's called falling out. And at the end of this aria, we're going to hear a little bit of the beginning, and then we'll skip to the very compelling conclusion that is just as compelling a conclusion as Un Bel Dì from Madame Butterfly, which, by the way, we're doing next year. So let's listen to the great Leontine Price as she gives us an example of musical pesto, this great synthesis of folk, jazz, and classical opera in My Man's Gone Now. Did you hear the falling out in that last slide, that last weeping and wailing slide up the vocal range? That's truly operatic, but not a kind of opera aria that Verdi or Puccini ever thought of writing. I think it's fabulous. Some folks get confused about Porgy and Bess as we move along here on WHRO FM, public radio for Norfolk and Hampton Roads, as we're taking a look at Porgy and Bess, which will premiere a week from tonight at the Harrison Opera House. We hope you'll be there. People get confused about Porgy and Bess and feel that, well, this is a Broadway show. I mean, it's got spoken dialogue in it. Well, never mind the fact that lots of operas, like Carmen, originally had spoken dialogue in them. how about this issue of is it an opera or a Broadway musical or an operetta? I guess I feel like that Supreme Court justice who once gave his opinion about pornography. I'm not sure how to define it, he said, but I know it when I see it. And for me, it's just sort of an accumulation of factors that tip the scales either in the musical or the opera direction. Now, yes, there is a little bit of spoken speech in Porgy and Bess, and that happens whenever the white folks come on stage. In this scene of the wake for Robbins, a detective comes along who's going to do an investigation of the murder. And he does not sing, he speaks. However, I wouldn't even really call this dialogue. What I would call it is anti-music. You know, think of it this way. When a composer writes a symphony or a piano sonata or what have you, he doesn't just compose the notes that the musicians play, he also composes the silences that they don't play. The silence is part of the music. And I would make the point that when you have this scene with the detective that you're about to hear, his absence of singing is part of the music because it brands him as an outsider. He is ostracized from this black community because he doesn't fit in. And the fact that he's not singing, you'll hear it's like a conversation with one shoe off and one shoe on. He speaks a question, they sing the answer. Speak a question, sing the answer. It's not dialogue, it's anti-music. Give a listen.
A Saucebarian set up, I see. You his widow?
Yes, sir.
He didn't leave any burial insurance?
Boys, he didn't leave nothing.
Well, you see to it he's buried tomorrow. You killed Robbins, and I'm gonna hang you for it.
I think that makes the point rather nicely. We can't really call that a dialogue scene, can we? In Act 2, there's an example of flat-out folk music. And again, I'm not sure that this is one of the more iconic musical numbers from Porgy and Bess. It's our friend Jake, that hard-working fisherman, who's going to give us the type of folk song that I would call a work song, music of the people. There are so many different examples of work songs, and in fact, in the African-American culture, there were these songs that slaves sang on plantations in the 19th century. Well, this is we're not on a plantation, and this is the 20th century when they're all free men and women, but it's a fishing community, so there's the specific kind of work song that might be called a sea shanty. Sea shanties are known in the world over, all over the planet, in any culture where people earn their living by the sea. This one has every earmark of folk music. The verse is completely in the pentatonic scale, the black keys of the piano. Regardless of the culture, regardless of the geographical location, virtually all of the world's folk songs wind up being based on the pentatonic scale. A little bit of trivia for you if you weren't familiar with that. That happens here. And then in the refrain, you'll hear what makes it a work song. As Jake sings, it takes a long pull to get there. You'll see that the refrain is in the rhythm of the work that is being done. The rhythm of the music is in accordance with the physical motion that he and his cronies have to do, whether it's pulling oars on a boat or shoving a boat into the water or hauling nets. And I think this is a gem of a number. I wish it was more popular. See if you like it as much as I do.
It take a
Fabulous. Now, we're going to do a little audience participation. Are you ready, listeners? I'm going to start to sing something, and you sing the next phrase back at me, because you all know it. I'll be listening. Ready? Oh, I got plenty of nuttin'. I heard you. That's right. Very, very good. Nuttin's plenty for me. Excellent. Thank you for auditioning today. We'll be in touch with you at Virginia Opera. Now, this song is perhaps the most commonly referred to number, the most iconic, the most beloved. It is sung by our protagonist, Porgy, and it seems to sum up his philosophy of life, and it seems to be a very optimistic and good-natured one, doesn't it? You know, there was a literary movement in fiction at this time called primitivism. Rousseau was the leader of the primitivist movement, and Du Bois-Hayward, who wrote the novel Porgy, was really writing another example of primitivism in which uneducated, noble savages, so to speak, are glorified because perhaps they don't know how to use a telephone or drive a car or work in a factory. They may not be able to read and write, these uneducated heroes, but they know important things about life and the universe that perhaps we in the modern rat race of technology have forgotten. It might be a bit patronizing, but this song seems to sum that up. I've got plenty of nuttin' and nuttin's plenty for me. Listen to this, and then I've got a question for you on the other side of this excerpt.
Oh, I got plenty of nothing, and nothing's plenty for me. I got no car, got no mule, got no misery. The folks with plenty, got a lock on that door. Afraid somebody's a-going to rob him while he's out a-making more. What for? Now I got no lock on my door, that's no way to be. They can steal the rug from the floor, that's okay with me, 'cause the things that I prize, like the stars in the skies, all are free. Oh, I got plenty of nothing, and nothing's plenty for me. I got my gal, got my soul.
Yeah, here's my question. That's about as happy and uncomplicated as a piece of music can be. Am I right? Pure happiness and joy, except, you know what? It really isn't. Friends, this is not a concert. This is opera. And when you're dealing with opera, the music almost always has some kind of literary quality, and one of those literary qualities that comes along so often is what we call irony. Let me tell you something. When Todd Duncan, who created the role of Porgy, was coaching this song with Gershwin, do you know what Gershwin told him? He said it's not a happy song. He said, I Got Plenty of Nuttin' is a bitter song. Think about these words. The folks with plenty got a lock on their door. They're out, they's afraid somebody is going to rob them while they's out a-making more. Well, Porgy and Bess debuted in downtown New York City in 1935. Who do you think was in the audience for that performance? Yeah, it was the folks with plenty who had a lock on their door. This song really is kind of an indictment of the lifestyle of the people who come to hear it. It is an extremely ironic song, and we get that from the composer's mouth. Now, here we come to something I think is kind of interesting. You know, can you think of a more American composer than George Gershwin? Oh, absolutely not. His music, and in fact, all the big Gershwin pieces, whether it's An American in Paris or Rhapsody in Blue or Porgy and Bess, they all have those big Gershwin moments. You know what I mean? Those heartwarming tunes that just seem to express the length and breadth of our great country and our optimistic American spirit. Here's a good example of one from Rhapsody in Blue. fabulous. Oh, I know you're disappointed that we stopped playing it, and if we could just hear the rest of it, it'd be so wonderful. But here's the point I want to make. Think of the contour of that melody. If you were going to paint on the wall of your house with a paintbrush and make motions that follow the contour of that type of melody, would it be like Georges Seurat and his pointillism, little nervous dabs? Not at all. You would take the biggest, broadest brush you could find, fill it up with paint, and make big, broad, vertical up and down strokes. Up and down like that. Now, is there a moment like that in Porgy and Bess? Yes, and it's our favorite one, isn't it? It's that great love duet when Porgy has taken that fallen woman Bess into his home and gotten her off of drugs, and she's discovered a wholesome way of life, and they proclaim their love for one another in the great duet, Bess, You Is My Woman Now. Now, as you listen to this, compare that contour with the contour of Rhapsody in Blue. Did you hear it, friends? Did you hear those big, vertical, up and down, broad brush strokes of melody? Very similar, isn't it? Now, does that sound uniquely American to you? For a lot of folks, it does. Yes, that optimism, that affirmative love of your fellow man, those broad melodies sound like the broad stretches of expanses of the prairies in our great country from sea to shining sea. Well, guess what? I don't hear America at all when I hear Rhapsody in Blue and Bess, You Is My Woman Now. Where were Gershwin's parents from? They're from Russia. Guess what? This music is pure Russia. As Russian as beet borscht with sour cream and vodka. You don't believe me? Okay, listen to the contour of a little bit of Tchaikovsky, something that you'll hear quite often on WHRO-FM Public Radio for Hampton Roads. The big love theme from Romeo and Juliet. Now, paint in your mind with your paintbrush. You're not convinced? Well, that's only one melody out of thousands, you're saying? Okay, a little more evidence. I present another bit of evidence for your consideration. How about some Rachmaninoff from the Second Piano Concerto? it turns out that our friend Porgy sings with a Russian accent. Who knew? I think that's kind of cool. Now, again, a little bit more evidence as to tipping the scales towards opera rather than musical or operetta. There is a scene in which Crown, the villain who's been hiding on Kittiwah Island, comes out and tries to commandeer Bess into staying with him when she's there for the picnic that the community has been having all day on that island. And they have a bit of what would normally in a Broadway show be dialogue. Here, let me read a little bit of what they're saying. They haven't seen each other for several weeks, and you know that the purpose of dialogue in a Broadway show is to advance the plot. Same with recitative in a Mozartian or Rossini or 18th century number opera. The recitative or the dialogue, that's when you exchange information and the plot advances. Then in the musical numbers, you kind of emote and express yourself about how you feel about what you've learned. Well, in this section, Crown jumps out and Bess says, "Crown." And Crown says, "You know very well this is Crown. I seen you land, and I've been waiting all day for to see you. I'm almost dead on this damn island." Bess says, "You ain't look most dead. You look bigger than ever." "Oh, well, I got plenty to eat," he says, "bird, egg, oyster, and such, but I almost dead of the lonesome with not one God person to swap a word with. Lord, I's glad you come. I can't stay, Crown, or the boat'll go without me. Damn that boat. Got any happy dust with you?" "No, Crown, no more happy dust. I got something to tell you." She's got something to tell him. She's got information. Well, surely you would set this as dialogue, wouldn't you? But listen to the very Puccini-esque continuous music with which Gershwin sets this so-called dialogue, really making it extremely operatic. And again, this is the Porgy and Bess Nobody Knows.
Waiting all day for see you. I'm most dead on this damn island.
You ain't look most dead, you bigger than ever.
Oh, I got plenty to eat, bread, egg, oyster, and such, but I'm most dead of the lonesome.
My friends, there is nothing remotely Broadway, jazz, blues, folk, Stephen Foster, minstrelsque. Nothing of that comes into that music. That is pure opera with a classical orchestra. And in fact, what the orchestra is doing is kind of weaving a textural web based on Crown's motive. Bum, 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 bum. It is as heavy operatic as you can get. Now, it is followed by a duet, which, again, for me, is a high point, one of the great masterwork moments of Porgy and Bess. Because now they are going to emote. Bess realizes that the happy life she's been knowing with Porgy, going to church, being off drugs, living a good, clean, wholesome life, she sees it slip-sliding away as the threat of this intimidating villain Crown is on her radar screen again. And she feels desperate, and she feels full of despair. She's going to sing, "What you want with Bess? Don't you want a younger, prettier girl? Why is this happening to me?" And for his part, Crown is going to say, "What I want with another woman? I want you, and no cripple like Porgy is going to take you from me." See, it's a matter of pride for him. This is, again, a wonderful fusion, synthesis of disparate musical elements. Bess is going to start singing with classic blues affect. And is there anything more appropriate to represent how she's feeling than blues rhythms and blues harmonies and structure? Not at all. And yet, there's going to be a definite classical and operatic element that will kind of elevate this music to a different plane. The vocal writing is so operatic. Towards the end of this clip that we're going to hear, their voices rise together to a climactic high note. But this is not just a high note to show off the lovely voices or to display vocal virtuosity as Tonio does in Donizetti's Daughter of the Regiment with those famous 9 high Cs. Again, Gershwin shows that he has masterful operatic dramatic instincts because while they're singing the same high note, they're for totally different dramatic reasons. Bess's voice rises to this note in desperation, screaming for pity, begging for mercy, whereas when Crown sings the same note, it's shouting her down, intimidation. It's not just about making a nice vocal sound, it's for a dramatic purpose. It's real opera music, and it's fabulous. I know some of you can't wait for summertime when a performance of Porgy comes along. That's a moment that I wait for because it's not as familiar as some of those familiar tunes, but it is the real stuff. Now, I've made the analogy of pesto versus Rachel's trifle. There are times when Gershwin really hits it out of the park at combining the elements of folk music, popular music, classical music, but keep in mind, he's only 35 years old as he's writing this, and it is his first opera, and there are moments that maybe are a little more jarring in the contrast of these styles that, for me, aren't quite as successful, even though the moment may provide a good toe-tapping tune. Now, consider the way you just heard Crown sing in these last 2 excerpts, that dialogue scene on Kittiwah that was sung a la Puccini, and that blues duet, What You Want with Bess. That was extremely operatic singing. It was extremely rigorous in the vocal writing and uncompromising in the musical style. But only a few minutes later, in another scene, we have this same character singing about how there's nothing he likes better than a red-headed woman.
A red-headed woman makes a choo-choo jump its track. A red-headed woman, she can make it jump right back. Oh, she's just nature's child. She's got something that drives men wild. A red-headed woman's gonna take you whether you're white, yellow, or black.
what are we to say about this? That's a little bit oil and water, is that's really the same character? Wow, it's like suppose Baron Scarpia, the villain in Tosca, suddenly started singing a buffo aria like Dr. Bartolo. It just, I don't know, there's a little lack of smoothness there. Again, if Gershwin had lived to be 80 years old and had written 10 or 12 more operas, just think of the mastery he would have achieved. Well, I'm going to close this program with another fabulous moment in this opera that you don't know. I'll bet you don't know it, and I'll bet if you do know it, it's not your favorite, and I'll tell you why it should be. You can't depict life in coastal South Carolina in any authentic basis without considering the phenomenon of the hurricane. Hurricanes are part of life. So, of course, a hurricane comes along. In fact, when Jake was singing his song, It Takes a Long Pull to Get There, the third verse intimated a little bit of foreshadowing. He said, if Mr. Hurricane comes along, then I'll tell Mr. Hurricane no, and I'll do my work anyway. And that is foreshadowing in a literary sense because Jake ignores the warnings of the weather and goes out to get in his day's fishing, and a hurricane does come up, and the residents of Catfish Row are huddled in Serena's room, waiting to discover his fate. They're fearing that he is lost at sea. Now we have, again, a musical number which is unique. There's not another chorus like this in all of opera. And it is the fruit of Gershwin's first-hand primary research. Gershwin went to prayer services. When people are sick or there's a crisis with one of your neighbors, the friends and relatives and relations will gather and have a prayer service. Oh, Dr. Jesus, look down upon us in your merciful wisdom, and clasp us to your bosom and heal your servant, and so forth. Well, now they're all huddled together waiting out the storm. And, a scene like this, if they're all praying to God for mercy and to be delivered from the storm, think of how any other opera composer would have handled this. You'd have a big chorus, and they would all sing together, oh, Dr. Jesus, save us from the storm, and so forth. Gershwin wanted something more natural and something that would more resemble the prayer services that he heard, where individuals are gathered in a room and they're all mumbling, praying out loud, but individually with no common kind of cadence, creating a kind of a mystical buzz of spoken prayers. What you're going to hear in this short excerpt, 6 vocal soloists, each singing a vocal line that's fully written out with notes and rhythms, but they don't sing it together in any kind of unison or any kind of texture that has any vertical quality to it. They're completely independent and completely random. If you heard this performed 10 times, it would sound slightly different every time. Is it tuneful? Is it pretty? Is it beautiful? Well, listen to it, and then we'll talk about it briefly on the other side. What are we to make of music like that? What do you even call it? Is it a song? Is it a chorus? If I ask you to whistle the melody to it right now, does it even have a melody? No, it really doesn't. It's For this reason, it's never going to be a popular moment in Porgy and Bess. We like those toe-tapping tunes. You'll notice I don't even have time today to play for you Sportin' Life's wonderful number. There's a boat that's leaving soon. Now, there's a tune. But what is the attraction? Why do I think so highly of this Dr. Jesus moment? Well, my friends, there's a difference between a pretty tune and beautiful music. What is the definition of beauty anyway? What do we mean when we say that any kind of art is beautiful, whether it's a play, a symphony, an operatic moment, a poem? I think it's kind of a cliche, but I think there's only one worthwhile definition of artistic beauty. It's when you tell the truth about people. It's when the art reveals fundamental truths about human nature and the human experience and human affect and psychology. That's what's happening here. Did you notice maybe it's not a great tune that you can enjoy humming on the way home from the Harrison Opera House, but doesn't it suggest the anxiety, the nervous anxiety in that tiny tenement housing room of a group of neighbors who are unsure if one of their own is alive or dead? Much more than a pretty tune might have done. Yeah, it's all about projecting. See, it has a dramatic purpose and a purpose of showing human nature. The anxiety of people in distress who are unsure of themselves, that I think is much more compelling and provocative and effective than if they had sung a nice hymn-like texture in 4-part harmony. This is, again, I think the potential that George Gershwin shows us in almost every instance, in every scene of his amazing first opera, Porgy and Bess. Once again, it's a wonderful thing that we have it. We're so glad that we have this iconic American opera. But what would he have accomplished if he'd lived 40 more years instead of discovering that brain tumor only a few months after the premiere of Porgy and Bess? Well, I hope that I have given you some insights that you weren't aware of with this wonderful opera. I hope you've enjoyed this. I look forward to coming back to Public Radio next season for some more previews of our 2010-2011 season. But most of all, I hope that starting a week from tonight on April 10th, we'll see you at one of our performances of Porgy and Bess. Please don't miss it. And thanks for listening today.